Hey everyone, welcome back to Cosmic Alarm Clock. You cannot make this up. This episode has been recorded 3 times on 3 separate dates, and I break it down for you throughout the whole trajectory of this 2-parter episode. Hello, Jupiter in Gemini with Mars going into Gemini with a throwback to when Mars retrograded in Gemini. Of course, this is a 2-parter, and this particular part has 2 parts. I already mentioned that in the first episode, so you know I'm not making that shit up. You can't make any of this shit up. If you listen to the rest of this episode, I'm just going to run into it because if I do not drop this episode, it will never get dropped because there is additional developments every time I try to drop this episode. And then there is this intuitive knowing to wait. And today did not disappoint, my friends. I am dropping this on the full moon in Capricorn. We are still within the 12-hour period of this full moon. It is full moon energy. This makes me feel so good because this is how this podcast started. It started with me birthing this on the Virgo full moon in April of 2022, March of 2022. And after that, I tried to make it like a real podcast like you're supposed to do. And it didn't want to be a real podcast because if you think about a cosmic alarm clock, it has no fucking time. And if there was a cosmic alarm clock, it is the full moon. Today we are at 29 degrees of Capricorn. And I don't normally talk about really, really timely stuff on this podcast so it can last forever. But you guys know 29 degrees of Capricorn, the anaretic degree, we're in a blue moon in Capricorn. And what has happened in the last month in the structures of society as we know it, I can't even keep up. And I literally recorded the first part of this episode because I was trying to get this out to you guys. Jupiter and Gemini Part II. I'm going to tell you about Jupiter and how it's all, goes through all the historics and all that stuff. And I got you. We'll get there at the end of Part 2. I go into all the Jupiter and Gemini historics, but man, oh man, do we go on a journey together before that. And in true fashion to how this podcast started, where I always said we're going backwards to go forwards, I have recorded this many, many times, and each segment of this podcast is legit. You know me, I don't lie. I said all the stuff that I said. I'm not saying it in retrospect because of the news events that happened. I said all this stuff. But I got to come on here and give you a quick boom, cherry on top before I drop this bad boy. Sunday afternoon. I'd announced to you guys on Friday that I was going to drop it on the full moon, and I never announce anything where I'm going to do it on a day, especially when it comes to Cosmic Alarm Clock, because then I have to stick to it. You know who just dropped out. I haven't said any names in this, so I did that on purpose. Man, oh man, was this podcast waiting for the clincher. And if you listen to the rest of this podcast, you'll understand why I'm so excited. It's because I said this in the first time I recorded this, which was hours before the Gemini moon cycle ended. And there's reasons for that. And I explained that. And I was like, this feels too Capricorn. These 2 people feel too Capricorn. I don't care what side you fall on. I was like, Aquarius is the future. Aquarius is different people, different types of people. This is not political. I don't care what you think about people's ability to whatever, or ability to win or whatever. This isn't about that. It's just that if you were an alien and you came down to planet Earth and you told them what Capricorn means from a collective perspective, that was so fucking Capricorn. I think I dropped a podcast on my podcast, which I never got up here, which speaks to this. Go back and listen to it. I think I dropped something when Jupiter entered Gemini on my podcast before I did a thing for this YouTube channel, whatever. I said the same thing, basically. I was like, something's going to shift, something's going to change. And we all know we've had crazy events since then. We had the Mars-Uranus conjunction. We all know what happened last weekend. Then we had all the crazy stuff. I talk about all of it. I also talk about all the stuff related to Jupiter and Gemini and all the greater collective stuff and courts and judges and systems breaking down. And hello, we had what just happened on Friday as I was literally planning to drop this episode. And then it wanted to wait when we had that big outage, crowd strike. Is there any more Aquarian name than that? Remember when Pluto last went into Aquarius? That was the French Revolution. Strap in, my friends, because this full moon is just a preview of what is to come. Pluto re-enters the 29th degree of Capricorn September 1st, and it leaves on Thanksgiving. So before the U.S. goes into the holiday season, we are in for a doozy. As you guys know, the U.S. kind of gets snoozy typically in the summertime, and then around Labor Day, everyone wakes up again and goes back to their routine, and then we snooze again around Thanksgiving. Well, this year, promises to be something to watch. September 1st through November 20th. We've already kind of seen the preview of what's to come with what was announced today. Does anyone actually out there believe that astrology is fake? My God, Uranus, Mars conjunct Agol, which is the Medusa's head. We saw what happened last weekend. The conjunction was on Monday. Full moon in Capricorn, 29 degrees. Literally, I just heard this and had to come record this because I was like, if I don't record this episode is never going to come out because I don't fucking even know what's going to happen tomorrow. Now, he endorsed, I don't know if that's going to be a good idea or a bad idea, but you have to admit, going back to what I said about this not looking Aquarian, I don't care what you think about this person, does not look like any other candidate ever. Period. That's Aquarius. Aquarius is the future of what is to come, and there is going to be more stuff happening and more unexpected events. This, again, is about collective energy, so I don't talk about how to take care of yourself. I do talk about different stuff on my community tab on YouTube. I don't have time to come on here right now and do timely YouTube videos that are going to expire. It's just not the best use of my energy. But I do little stuff on my community tab, and I announced all this stuff as it was happening. And Mars went into Gemini yesterday. And this is a throwback to when Mars retrograded September through January of 2022. It was September of 2022 through January of 2023. Makes it even more powerful because Mars is life force and Jupiter and Gemini. This is going to amp up this Jupiter and Gemini energy. Mercury's gone retrograde. What is Mercury? The news. What is Gemini? The news. So that's all I got to say. That's a little bit of a personal look at that in your life. Where's Mercury going retrograde? Where did Mars go retrograde? This is a return to that now. And Mars goes retrograde again in Leo in December. I believe we enter Leo season at 3 a.m. tonight. So game on, my friends. Enjoy this episode. There are multiple parts. This part was obviously done today on July 21st. I briefly touched upon what happened on Friday with the crazy batshit on July 19th. I think I recorded something on July 15th, and then I recorded something on July 5th. All of it's relevant. All of it's useful. It talks about the collective energies. It talks about the state of the union of what we're in, and it talks about Jupiter and Gemini from a historic perspective. That part's its own little thing. That's at the end of the second part. Jupiter and Gemini, we've got a two-parter, and this part is two parts. Enjoy. Thank you so much for listening to Cosmic Alarm Clock, and I will return when Pluto enters Aquarius, and I'm sure there's going to be more to talk about at that time. Take care. Hey everyone, welcome back to Cosmic Alarm Clock. We're going to do this old school style, unhinged, unedited, unpolitically correct, off the cuff. Here we go. This is going to be an unusual and interesting part 2 to the Jupiter in Gemini thing I did. And it's going to be, guess what, a two-parter, because it's just going to be too damn long. For you guys who are not familiar, Gemini is the twins. And so that's just how this wants to go. And I'll just quickly share that I promised you guys that episode sometime in early June, and it just didn't want to come out. And then finally, I had this spontaneous thing that I recorded right before we left the Gemini moon cycle, which was July 5th, literally 2 hours before we left that moon cycle, which means the power is over, the energy is abated. I had this download and I recorded all this stuff, which would make sense because we had the Gemini season, we had the moon cycle in Gemini. And so if I'm talking about Jupiter in Gemini, pure play, then let's just really talk about Jupiter in Gemini. Recorded the episode, and I, in true cosmic alarm clock fashion, if you don't know, cosmic alarm clock means there is no fucking linear time. I talk about events and mention stuff related to all of this stuff that's super, super interesting and important. I just recorded a bunch of podcasts for my other podcast, The Aligned Alchemist, and I am out of gas, but the stuff is good. And I talked about politics, and I talked about what I expected for the election and the crazy shit and the stuff that was going on with the judicial system and the stuff that was going on with the court case in Massachusetts. And then I went into a deep kind of historic deep dive, which is what I promised you, on the last times that Jupiter was in Gemini and what that meant for society and historics and numbers and dates and all that stuff. And I actually went back all the way to 1977 because 1977 is when Ma Bell was formed, the phone company. It's also when I was born. But I wanted to do a couple of Jupiter in Gemini episodes, or whatever you want to call it, pieces that had to do with pre-internet. Because one of the key periods that Jupiter was in Gemini was, I believe, 2000, 2001. It's all in that episode. And this is channeled. I'm not looking at it. So you get an idea of kind of like 2 eras before and 2 eras past. But I also went in a whole fucking deep dive because Cosmic Alarm Clock is the State of the Union. It is just what I feel like you need to know. So I talked about Neptune in Pisces and what it means when it switches over into Aries. I talked about what's going on with Pluto in Aquarius. And guess what? You think it's a coincidence when this finally wants to drop? It's going to drop on the full moon in Capricorn on Sunday, or I think it's the 21st. That is when the full moon is at 29 degrees of Capricorn, which will be conjunct Pluto. Death and rebirth, my friends. Capricorn, traditional structures, the last Capricorn full moon before Pluto moves into Aquarius, the day before Thanksgiving, when the U.S., quote, breaks for the holidays. But of course, we're going to get a U.S. election in there. And I talk about that in depth in this episode. And so this is a preview. This full moon is a preview and a full moon culmination of what has not been working. Remember, Pluto went into Capricorn in 2008. Does anyone remember what happened in 2008? I was living in New York City and working at the time. I know what the fuck happened. Financial meltdown. Nobody had a job. It was chaos. And we have chaos in a very different way. I'll probably drop both episodes together. And why am I going to drop all those episodes? And why am I even declaring I'm going to drop something on a day, which I rarely do because then I have to stick to it? It's because after I recorded that episode, I still didn't release it. I don't know why. I listened to my energy and intuition and what it takes me to do, and something told me not to release it. And then I waited until the grand Mars-Uranus conjunction in Taurus, which I posted on my community tab about. We all know what happened that day. The lead up, by the way, that peaked that Monday after the big incident in the US. And it's been batshit since then. I got to drop this episode because I'm just going to have more and more stuff to talk about. And this is never going to get out. So when I told you guys, don't worry about the fact that I'm going to get this episode out when I do, it's because this has nothing to do with Jupiter moving into Gemini. Jupiter is going to be in Gemini this entire year. It's through May of 2025. It's especially important, and I go into this in the episode, because Uranus is going to enter Gemini like a month later. It's going to take seconds, but it's going to give us a preview. And as you know, Uranus is the unexpected events. By the way, Uranus rules the internet, and Gemini rules communication and transportation. And I already talked about all of that in the prior recorded episodes, and I discussed that. And guess what? Weekend, after all the other crazy batshit happened, is there any more of an Aquarian name than CrowdStrike? Massive fucking chaos that shut down the government, that shut down airlines. Are you guys getting a sense? And we had what happened last weekend. Then we had the RNC, which I talk about in this episode. We had the Teamsters speak. We had Amber Rose speaking. I'm like, what? This is a national convention. And I already explained in the episode, this is going to be a multiple layer episode, or prompt each part of the episode to state, so you kind of know why I'm talking about things that already kind of happened, but then we've had updates. And that's cosmic. It's the age of Aquarius is coming. And I'm not using names of anybody in this podcast. I didn't do that intentionally, but I think that's probably a good idea because we already know censorship on platforms. And this isn't meant to be a political podcast. I'm not a political person, and I share that in the episode. This is just discussing the crazy shit that's happening and how it relates to astrology. This is a preview. Jupiter in Gemini is a preview of what is to come when Uranus goes into Gemini. Our communication systems are connected. Everything is connected, which is a good thing and a good thing. And I think Uranus in Gemini is going to show us how we need to be more undependent on some of these systems. And Uranus in Taurus is reminding us to grow our own food, get on our solid ground, get on our own land, make our own money, figure our shit out, because being dependent on all this crazy shit is probably not the best idea. And I'll just leave you with one last bit, and then I'll get into all the other stuff I record, talk about transportation and Gemini and Jupiter and blah, 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 blah. And all this stuff is all the stuff going on in Hollywood, and how I think Biden just announced he has disease or a specific sickness, which I know you're talking about. And now he's getting called to drop out. So I don't think we've seen anything yet. So Pluto goes back to 29 degrees of Capricorn on September 1st. And it leaves on November 20th. So we still have some time, my friends. We're still in this full moon energy. Everything in astrology is generally the approach. So this full moon is about 6 a.m. or so, 6:30 a.m. on Eastern Standard Time. This is going to be unusual. I already went through how unusual this was in the last episode from a political perspective, about how the election was already kind of decided early, and now it's even basically a slam dunk so early on in the process. But then now we might have a candidate drop out. And I kind of predicted it. I said all this because the one thing, whether or not you are whatever side you're on, I'm not playing this game, neither of these candidates say Age of Aquarius to me. Different reasons are old. They represent the old paradigm in such arcane ways, such obvious ways. They represent the old paradigm. And so if Biden was to drop out and his forerunner or his other person was to come in, I'm not saying she's capable or not, whatever. She represents a very different person in a race than what we've seen. From a gender perspective, from a race perspective, she's an immigrant and she's half black. She's about as Aquarian flip as we've gotten. This is not about whether or not I think she should win or not or whatever. I'm just saying that would feel more Aquarian and more futuristic than what we've got. But I think what we've got, regardless of what we've got going on, you're going to listen to all of this and pick up what the thread is, which is that this is the breakthrough to break down, to break through, blah, blah, blah. That's Kali, that's Pluto, that's what's happening. And that's what's going to continue to happen. I don't think it's going to continue to happen at this breakneck speed once we hit Thanksgiving. Again, it's a kind of a Pluto enters Aquarius. We shut for the holidays. I'm not saying that the entire world is the US. I'm just speaking for that. Things really shut down. And then, January 2025 is going to be a game changer. And I think 2025 and 2026 are going to be crazy. Uranus and Gemini speeding towards the cross of the rising. If I'm working through, so do you. Everyone's exhausted. Hello. This isn't your imagination. So what's interesting is the people that don't pay attention to energy to stir the pot. This is just what's happening. And that's what Cosmic Alarm Clock is. And I don't really know where Cosmic Alarm Clock's going to go after this, because and all the above. But I still got a couple episodes in me, and that's going to be Pluto entering Aquarius, Neptune entering Aries, which will be next spring, and the node switching. And I've already talked a lot about what all of that is. So I don't know. Maybe this is the last alarm clock. I don't know. Maybe that would make sense when I'm on a Sunday, which is a full moon. But I don't know. And I don't need to know. And stay tuned for the last episode I recorded for you guys. I titled Jupiter into Gemini Part 1. And I talked about Jupiter moving into Gemini. That was late May of 2024. I talked about why it was important from a macro collective perspective. I talked about how it was impactful, even though Jupiter was not an outer planet. This summer being the last degree of Pluto in Capricorn, we will officially enter that Labor Day weekend, what that signifies, what Neptune in Pisces has meant, how this all builds up to Uranus moving into Gemini next summer, the significance of everything going on. And I try to make these macro enough that even if you're listening to this in July of 2024, you're listening to this in November of 2024, you're listening to this in spring of 2025, it's interesting to you. And that's why I don't talk about personalized astrology on here. But what I find fascinating about this podcast is that the timing is always impeccable. I will choose to come on here or choose to relaunch episodes or do something right when something macro is shifting. So I recorded that episode a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to get into it towards the end of it. And it ended up being, I recorded it literally minutes before we entered the Cancer moon cycle. And if you understand astrology, that's significant because when Jupiter moved into Gemini, we were just about to enter Jupiter. I believe we were in a Gemini season, and we were about to enter the Gemini moon. And then I still didn't put it up. That was like 2 weeks ago or whatever, a week ago. And then so much shit's happened since then. So I am recording this on Monday, July 15th of 2024. That is the day of the Uranus Mars conjunction in Taurus. Big fucking deal. Seed planting for the next 2 years. Now, astrologers have been talking about this all week. I posted stuff on my community tab, and I talked about the Mars-Uranus conjunction, Mars being unpredictable events, Uranus being unpredictable events and sudden changes and reversals and crazy shit, and Mars being anger and war. And this happening Argyle, which I'm not super into fixed stars, but it's associated with the head of Medusa, blah, blah, blah. We know what happened this weekend. Anybody who was tuned into energy was feeling this intensity, and we saw crazy shit happen. What's interesting about that event is if you listen to the second half of this podcast, I talked a lot about how unpredictable this whole election year is going to be. And I talked about how weird it was that these two very Capricornian white men who, whether or not, whatever side you're on, this podcast is not political. I could give a fuck. I think the whole thing's fake. It's all brainwashing. And I talk about it. It's all divide and conquer. You know, look at any ancient cultures where people have taken over. This is not about white people. This is just historically they took over indigenous people through numbers. It's a divide and conquer strategy. They did it in Africa. They did it in India. They did it in a lot more places that I'm not familiar with, and it works. That's what the political system is here, right? We're all fighting each other about trans shit and dumb shit, and that roof is on fire and no one's paying attention. So I'll leave it at that. Again, not a political podcast. If you're listening to this, you get it. It's not political, but neither candidate represents fresh energy. Neither candidate represents what we would think of as an Aquarian age. And so it was just weird to me. I'll stop talking because I probably already talked about this in the second half of the episode. And that talks about Jupiter and the historics. And I go into Jupiter and Gemini way back to 1977, the last 4 times it is in Gemini, and how it affected transportation and communication. And that's really fascinating, actually. It's, you know, astrology cycles and math and analytics. And when you look at it, the mundane, and it's always accurate, but it's still cool to see. So stay tuned for that towards the end. But I go into a lot of other stuff before that. And that's how I do this. This is my opportunity to be completely unscripted. I don't sell anything on this podcast. You can support this podcast by liking it and sharing it and commenting and asking questions. That's how the YouTube algorithm will propagate this. And that's how I'll continue to put this up on YouTube. At any rate, crazy shit this weekend, Mars-Uranus conjunction. Something that's really interesting about this is it's happened in Taurus. And last November, I had done an episode on the Sun-Mars conjunction in Scorpio. That is a completely separate event. And Scorpio and Taurus are polar signs. As you know, the first episode of this entire podcast was a commentary on when the nodes were in Scorpio and Taurus. So I did a whole deep dive on the mundane collective aspects of Scorpio and Taurus. Scorpio being sex rings and secrets and power struggles and other people's money and mysteries. And Taurus being the body, feminine energy, bringing things to light, owning your own plot of land, getting yours, creative genius, pleasure in the body, getting back to earth, nature, etc. All in the greater context of everything else that's happening right now. So I think it's really interesting that that's where that conjunction happened. No one's really talking about that. And I did a whole episode of Cosmic Alarm Clock, and I will re-put that back up on the podcast. I went through this weird phase, very unlike me, by the way, where I pulled all the old episodes of Cosmic Alarm Clock from Spotify and Apple. I kept all the files. Very unusual for me, and I don't know why I did that. I don't know. I mean, I had gone back and edited it using a microphone, a lot of them, so they didn't sound so hollow, but I'm going to put all of them back up there. And one of them I talked about was the Mars and Sun conjunction in Scorpio that happened in November of 2023. And I don't think I talked about the collective aspects of that. I might have, but that's just really important because if you think about power, Mars and Sun are really your day-to-day purpose and power and how you move through the world. And Scorpio is very intense. It's a fixed sign and emotions and the hidden. And then Taurus and Uranus is like the opposite of that. It's the opposite of what's hidden. It's money. It's living on the earth plane. It's not magic. It's just like getting the fucking work done, taking care of your body, making that money. Uranus is your creative genius. So those two things from a personalized perspective are just a really interesting thing for you to be aware of. We had a 2-year seed planting that happened then. We have a 2-year seed planting happening now. So, as I mentioned, we're kind of going backwards to go forwards. I am recording this part of the podcast is in the energy of the full moon, of the Capricorn full moon, where it's a conjunct Pluto at 29 degrees. And we just had some of the events that just happened. And then I recorded this other part I talked about, which I said I recorded on Monday, the Mars Uranus conjunction in Taurus, and talking about that. And now I'm referencing the original part 2 that I already on June 5th. And that's what I'm going to release as a part 2. So know that that part 2 was me just musing about stuff, and it's all relevant to what's happened. But that was pre the events that happened, the Mars-Uranus conjunction, the political stuff, and then pre what happened with the outage and the calls for one of the people to leave. I want to get this out there before other crazy stuff happens. I'm sure that some of the entertainment stuff that I mentioned in the first part of the podcast is going to come to light later this summer. Remember, Pluto plows, and when Pluto enters right around the time that the U.S. comes back from summer vacation, which is basically Labor Day weekend, Pluto is going to be primed to do some additional plowing. I had mentioned in that podcast a lot of the political stuff that was happening with the trial in Massachusetts and then this crazy young thugs trial. Remember, Jupiter rules the law. Its ruling planet is Sagittarius. Sagittarius rules the law. And I talked about how part of this Capricorn breakdown is shit coming to light of control structures that are not working and a awareness of power struggles in the legal system that we all know have unfortunately put people behind bars or ruin people's lives in ways that are not fair. The legal system is not fair. And there's a lot of people at the helm in the legal system that have a lot more power than they should. And through social media, through the news, hello, Gemini, we are seeing that no longer be acceptable. So literally right before I went to re-record this, the judge from the Young Thugs trial has just been recused. Forcibly recused. He refused. And that was through political pressure and through social pressure. And so when I get into the rest of the episode, I talk about it. Remember, I recorded that episode last week. And then since last week, and I talked about all the crazy shit happening in Massachusetts with those cops, since I talked about that, that head cop has been suspended. And they have also found out that the jury has now been saying that they actually acquitted her. This isn't about who's guilty, who's not guilty. This is just to highlight the power that, and this judge in Atlanta is black, and these people in Massachusetts are part of the Irish mafia, which is the South Shore. It's not about race. This is about putting people in power that go unchecked. Even when they do wrong, they are so adamant that they'll get away with it, that they're just brazen. And it's now coming to light that they can't get away with anything. The one piece that I talked about I believe I talked about it in the Jupiter Gemini piece, is P. Diddy. And that will probably come to light later this summer. And who knows who that's going to bring down. But again, we'll get into the rest of the full episode because I don't know what I already said and I don't want to repeat myself, but I talk about Jupiter and Gemini. I talk about what it means from a collective perspective. I talk about the historics of Jupiter and Gemini. I talk about Pluto going to the last degree of Capricorn, Labor Day weekend. I talk about Neptune that is at its last degree of the zodiac, 29 degrees of Pisces. It retrograded there 3 minutes from entering Aries, which is the first sign of the zodiac. So the universe is not ready yet. We are holding on by a thread, and that is by design. This is mutation energy, you guys. In human design, Pluto is sitting in gate 60. Gate 60 is part of the channel of mutation. So those of us who have gate 3, those of us who are change agents, those of us who are ahead of our time, this is our time because society is ready for mutation. Because of a lot of the stuff I'm saying to you, I had said 3 years ago, 4 years ago, you'd have thought I'm fucking crazy. We've got this build up to the election, and then we are about to enter the new era, which is Pluto in Aquarius. I've already talked a lot about Pluto going into Aquarius. I've already talked about Neptune moving into Aries, and I've already talked about what this means for Jupiter moving to Gemini. But I do think there'll be at least 3 more episodes of Cosmic Alarm Clock left in me. One is the Pluto moving to Aquarius. One is when the nodes switch next January. And one is when Neptune moves into Aries. I do think then when Uranus enters Gemini, we are entering a new chapter. I think I am entering a new chapter at that time, but who the fuck knows? Thank you for listening to Cosmic Alarm Clock. Enjoy the episode.